The movie Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Actually, this is one of my favorite movies. And it was about them trying to find the lost Ark of the Covenant. The chest that contained the 10 Commandments. And this is the object that is in the furthest, all the way back in the Tabernacle. And so, as you remember, if you've seen it, this was a long time ago. By the end of the movie, they dared open this thing. And God's holy wrath rained down on all of the Nazis, and fire and lightning came out and struck them all dead. Because you're not to look upon this thing. It was a powerful relic. So anyway, we come to our last week in the Tabernacle. Now, as you remember, during this 40 years, God was basically living with his people in the tent. He instructed them to make this in a particular way, and everything was symbolic and had significant meaning, and it all pointed to something. It wasn't just random, haphazard. They put up a tent in any way that they wanted to. When Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the law from God, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, he instructed them. He said, I will show you the plan of how to build this thing. It was intentionally designed by God, and they carried it out. This is the outer perimeter of the complex. And what's interesting, there's just the one way into the tabernacle complex. As we said, there's no other way. You can't jump over it. There's no side entrance. There's no back entrance. God is theologically saying that there is one way to come to me. There is one door, and we understand this to be in the person of Christ Jesus. So when we came in, you would come in, we talked about the second week, we talked about the altar. So what God is saying, before you come to me, and God resides here all the way in the back, as we know he was in the room, the Holy of Holies that we're going to talk about today, and his presence would be seen hovering above the tabernacle as a pillar of cloud by day and as a pillar of fire by night. And this was like a direct line to God. And he was saying, before you get to me, you first have to address your sin. You cannot come to me with your sin. I am pure, I am holy. We have to first establish a relationship. You have to understand that you are sinful, and that to come to me, you have to confess your sin, and it has to be forgiven. So you would come to the priest with your lamb, okay? And we talked about there was many different kind of sacrifices for many different particular reasons. We talked about these in the second week. I'm not going to go into them other than to say, there was the drink offering, the grain offering, the burnt offering, the praise offering. There's like 7 different specific ones for specific sins. And so there was a certain way you had to do this. But basically what you would do is, for the guilt offering or the sin offering, you would bring a lamb. And you would walk through the door. You'd walk through the one door to get to God. But by one door, we know there's no other way to God. There are not many paths to God. There is only one way to God. You would bring your lamb to the priest, and he was your representative before God. And what you would do, you would take your hands and you would press your hands against the head of the lamb, symbolically transferring your sin to the animal, the innocent lamb. And then you would take a knife. The priest would hand you a knife. You would take the knife and you would stick the lamb until it would slowly bleed to death. And once that was done, you would hand over to the priest the lamb, took it to the altar, which was basically just a big furnace, and you would throw it in there, and it would be burnt up, symbolically showing that God has not only forgiven your sins, that it is forgotten. It becomes like charcoal. Once that was done, the priest's hands would have been bloody from dealing with the animal, dealing with your sin. So you would bring it up to the laver or to the water basin. And the water basin, he would cleanse his hands. And it symbolizes sanctification, what we call holiness. Now, your forgiveness of sin, the forgiveness happened, the washing and the cleansing of the forgiveness of your sin happened at the altar. But the washing shows that you are holy before God. Once you were holy before God as the priest, then you could walk into the complex itself. You could walk into the structure itself. But once you got to this part, you come through the one entrance, you come to the altar, you come to the water basin, you pass through the curtain into the main, to the tabernacle itself. And as you remember, off to the left, we talk about was the lampstand, made of pure gold, symbolizing Christ because he is pure, he is divine. And the menorah, as it's called, or the lampstand, would need to be, every day the priest would have to go in and trim the wicks and fill the oil. We understand oil is the representation of the Holy Spirit. But as this light is to remind us that we're to live the light of God, we're to live Christ's light. Christ's light shines through us. On the right-hand side, we have the table of showbread. It was constructed of gold and wood, symbolizing man and God, or Christ, who is both man and God at the same time. The loaves of bread, there was a loaf of bread, 12, one for each tribe of Israel, but it also shows God's providence for us. In the ancient world, the gods that they worship, they would bring food to keep their god, their idols that they worship, to keep the god sustained. God does not need food. At the end of the week, when the bread was changed out by the priest, they would all gather around and they would share in the bread before they replaced it with the new bread. God provides for his people. Christ is the bread of life. And so we worship Christ, and he is our spiritual sustenance. And it reminds us to stay in the Word, the Word of life, and in God's holy Word. Because Christ says to Satan, he said, "You shall not live by bread alone, but by the very words of God." So then last week we looked at the altar of incense. I know we all remember that because we walked in here, and if you were here and you smelled the smoke, very interesting that all of the senses were heightened when you walked in here. Because you walked in, you saw the menorah lit on the left, the lampstand. That was the only source of light in this place. If that thing went out, the place was pitch black. But it was visual, so you could see the light. Priests would eat the bread. You walked in and you would immediately smell the fragrance of God that was burning in the Mishkan. And then the altar of incense, there was only fragrances were burned on there, not animals. But you would walk in there and it would be a symbol of prayer before God. It stood before this large curtain and these beams that separated the holy place, the main area, the main sanctuary, from the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant itself was contained. So you would stand and they would pray to God, and the smoke would drift up, symbolizing your prayers going to heaven. That reminds us that in the Christian life, we're first as the menorah, we're to radiate God, the love of Christ, the light of Christ. We're to be in his word, the table of showbread, the table of presence. We're to be in his word. And finally, with the altar, we're to be people who are in prayer. Prayer, as we talked about last week, is communication with God. That's communication to God. The way we receive communication from God is by reading his holy word. So that's where we have been, and this is a picture of, this is in Israel. This is a full-scale model. This is the inside of the outside that we've been looking at, okay? So you walk in, it's not very big. You have the menorah on the left, the lampstand. You got the table of presence. Then you got the altar. Then you got the curtain, and behind that is the inner room that was 15 feet by 15 feet by 15 feet. And it was completely black. And the ark was kept in there, and it was covered up, and it was just never be seen. And we'll talk about that here shortly. So if you will, if you're able to, I'll ask you to stand for the reading of God's holy word. I'm going to be reading from Exodus chapter 25 regarding God's holy decree on the construction of the ark. He says, "They shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, 1 cubit and a half its breadth, and 1 cubit and a half its height. Shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and outside you shall overlay it. Shall make on it a molding of gold around it, and you shall cast 4 rings of gold and put it on its 4 feet, 2 rings on one side of it and 2 rings on the other side. Shall make the poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. Shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, carry the ark by them. Poles shall remain in the rings of the ark and shall not be taken from it. Shall put into the ark the testimony that I shall give you. To make a mercy seat of pure gold, which is a lid. 2 cubits and a half shall be its length, 1 cubit and a half its breadth. Shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work shall you make them. On the 2 ends of the mercy seat, make 1 cherub on one end and 1 cherub on the other end. Of one piece with the mercy seat shall you make the cherubim on its 2 ends. Cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, their faces towards one another. Toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubim be. You shall put on the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. There I will meet with you from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony. I will speak to you about all that I will give you in the commandment for the people of Israel." You may be seated. I know that was long, but put the picture up there so we could get a good idea of what this thing looked like. I remember talking about Indiana Jones. I remember when I was little, that made an impression upon me. I was really impressed by that. Watched that movie over and over again. And I remember going back to Scripture, because I don't remember hearing much about it. I remember reading about it. As I got older, I always kept that in mind, and there was one point in my life where I was still going to church every so often, but that time I grew up with this idea, like, I am not going into the ministry like my dad did. I don't want to do it. And I told myself I'm not doing it. I don't want to do it. Things my dad went through, it wasn't very, wasn't very pleasant. I'm like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. So that was my attitude. And I remember having watched this, and I don't know, I'd seen it sometime later, and for myself, I was really captivated by it and interested. So I remember started reading the Bible, trying to find out all the places in the Bible where this thing was mentioned. Then I thought, I want to be able to read it in the original text. So I remember going to the seminary. Before I even went there, I remember I went and took a class in Hebrew so I could start reading the Bible, find out more about this as it was originally written in the text. And then one thing led to another, and then I started to understand the theology of the Old Testament, and then I wanted to understand how the New Testament related in a deeper way to the Old Testament, and it kind of was like dominoes falling. And as a result, I think God used that as a way, and here I am today. Fast forward 30 years later, and here I am today. But anyway, just some specifics about this item. 45 feet. It's 45 inches long, 27 inches high, 27 inches wide. Now, it talk about the lid. We'll talk about called the mercy. The translations sometimes use the word. But it's the lid. Now, when you look at this thing, it's called the ark. Okay, but in as God describes it, okay, in its construction, it is actually 2 separate pieces of furniture. One is the bottom chest itself, okay, and then you have the lid of it that goes on top. Okay, it's considered 2 separate pieces. Now, this is called the mercy seat because you have to think of this like a throne. like a king sitting on a throne. Okay? Because it said God sat on it. His presence was above this thing. It hovered above this presence. His very presence. What is called his Shekinah glory. As he appeared before Moses originally as a cloud, he hovered above this thing. Okay? So he was symbolically sitting on this thing like a golden throne, as a king would sit upon his throne. So this, it's the place of mercy. It's called the mercy seat. The reason is that because as God would sit on this, and we're going to see today, when once a year. Now we've talked about all of the 7 different types of sacrifices that were made at a particular time in a particular way. All right. Those 7 that we talked about did not in fact cover everything. It was specific kinds of sins. So even when those 7 types of sacrifices you would come to the priest and make at the altar, it did not cover every single offense. Once a year, priests would come on the Day of Atonement, called Yom Kippur. They still celebrate it to this day, usually around July, August, somewhere around there. All right? It's the Day of Atonement, and that's what this means. The word for this in the Hebrew comes the word kafar. Kippur comes from that word. It means atonement or forgiveness. And what would happen is, the priest would come in. He would bring a bowl full of blood of a bull. Okay? What he would do is he would dip his finger into the bowl of blood, and once he would shake it and spill the blood onto the lid. Okay? Then he would take his finger and dip it back into the bowl, and he would sprinkle it 7 times in front of the ark. Okay? And this symbolized God's forgiveness of sin. So when the blood goes on here, it's symbolizing God's forgiveness of sin, because the Day of Atonement forgave every other sin for the year, for all of the Israelites, for all of them. Okay? That is until Christ came along. Okay? But remember that the word means to cover up. So sins were covered up temporarily until Christ came along, and they were absolutely eradicated and wiped away. That's why it's called the mercy seat, because God is showing mercy in forgiveness of sins. God would sit above the ark. This was a powerful item we're going to look today. It had to be handled in a certain way, and God is very specific and said, you have to, because I am so holy, okay? This has to be handled in a certain way. If you don't do it, things will happen. It's very, very dangerous. Okay? So the lid is the mercy seat, made of solid gold. The chest itself, on the inside, its guts, so to speak, were made of acacia wood. Okay? And then it was layered in gold. Okay? We know that acacia or wood symbolizes man, and gold symbolizes divinity, God. So we see Christ in this. But also the lid itself is solid gold. So the idea is the closer you get to God, the more pure it becomes. So it's called the ark singular. It's not the arks. Place of the lid at the top is the place of redemption or salvation for all of Israel. So in Leviticus 16 that we talked about, the priest would go in once a year and he would spill the blood over the ark and in front of the ark. And the thing is, this thing, as beautiful as it was, or is somewhere, we'll talk about that later, never to be seen. That was the whole irony of the whole thing. Because God is never to be seen. In Genesis 33, and Moses says, please pull back. He says, I want you to pull back the veil that's in front of you. He said, I want to see you as you are in your full glory. That's dangerous. God said, you cannot see me. No one can look upon me, my holiness, and live. Because I am so holy and man is so sinful. You cannot see me in my full absolute glory. You cannot do it. So it's very theological. So it stayed in this dark room all the time, this beautiful object that we can only imagine. I mean, we have the physical description of it, but no one ever really saw the thing. It was when it was transported around, the thing was covered up with cloths so nobody could gaze upon it. But this thing was carried in battle. Israel would go into battle and carry this thing in front of them. And they would be victorious when God's blessing was upon them. When this had to be transported, it was transported by 4 different priests by the poles, and it was carried on their shoulders. Poles, once they were inserted, were never to come out. So when the priest, during the Day of Atonement, the priest would come in here, or would be here, he'd come in through the front door, maintain the objects as they needed to be, and then he would walk in here. It would be dark. Would have to sprinkle the blood on top of the ark, symbolizing the forgiveness of sins. Now, and I mentioned this one other time, Jewish tradition, this is the Bible, this is Jewish tradition, their own history says that whenever the priest walked in here, they had a rope tied to his ankle, and sometimes they say they had bells around the bottom of his robe, so they could hear him in there. They knew he was moving. Because the idea was, when you were standing in front of this thing, it was like you were standing before God Himself. Once you walk past this, you are in His very, very presence. Because His presence was hovered above the ark. He was there. That was as close to God as you can get back then. That was it. You were right there in His face. The idea was they were so afraid that if he went in there with some kind of impure thought, or he had something that he hadn't asked forgiveness for, or any kind of impurity in his heart or in his mind, being in the very presence of holy God, he would fall dead. So they had the rope because no one else is going to want to go in there and fish him out, right? So they would pull him out if that were to happen with the rope. So very serious business. You didn't mess with this thing. So, we'll be reading from Exodus chapter 37, almost a similar passage. It says, Bezaleel made the ark of acacia wood. 2.5 cubits high was its length, and 1.5 cubits with its breadth. 1.5 cubits, and it was 1.5 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold inside and outside, and made a molding of gold around it. And he cast on it 4 rings on its 4 feet, 2 rings on the side and 2 rings on the other side. And he made the poles of acacia wood, and overlaid them with gold. Poles into the rings and the sides of the ark to carry the ark. And he made a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits was its length, and 1.5 cubits was its breadth. He made 2 cherubim of gold. Cherubim were like angels. He made them of hammered work on the 2 ends of the seat, 1 cherub on one end and 1 cherub on the other end. 1 piece he made with the mercy seat, he made with the cherubim on its 2 ends. Cherubim spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, faces towards one another. Mercy seat with the faces of the cherubim.
And they shall make an ark of acacia wood. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and out you shall overlay it, and shall make on it a moulding of gold all around. You shall cast 4 rings of gold for it, and put them in its 4 corners. 2 rings shall be on one side, and 2 rings on the other side. And you shall make poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold. You shall put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark, that the ark may be carried by them. The poles shall be in the rings of the ark, they shall not be taken from it. And you shall put into the ark the testimony which I will give you. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, of hammered work you shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make one cherub at one end, and the other cherub at the other end, and you shall make the cherubim at the two ends of it one piece with the mercy seat. And the cherubim shall stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat. You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you. And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel.
So it has an interesting history. It's mentioned a few times throughout the Bible. It's also interesting to note that it's mentioned its history is in the Old Testament. There are two references to it in the New Testament, but basically after the close of the Old Testament, all references, direct references to it just vanish, and it's just as if it just disappears and never mentioned in the Gospels. Jesus never talks about it. Paul never talks about it. We understand that, well, like I said, it's referenced in the book of Hebrews and once in Revelation, but never never directly as if it was they had it. It was just lost. After the year 586 BC in the Old Testament, King Nebuchadnezzar came in. This is just about the time of the book of Daniel, just before the book of Daniel, about that time. He came in and he went through and wiped out Israel, went to the temple, took all the belongings, and went back to Babylon and took Jerusalem, or took the Israelites with him. Those were left that weren't killed. But this is never directly mentioned, and it's thought there's different theories. We'll mention it a little bit here in a little bit. But after that time, it's never mentioned again in Scripture. Just like the thing just vanishes right out of Scripture. It's just forgotten. But anyway, with the references that we do have in the Bible, we'll look at that so we can understand a little bit better what this object is and significance. Remember, it was also, if you remember several months ago, we did a Sunday when we talked about the fall of Jericho. This is what was used. Priests walked around it for 7 days and 7 times. They carried this thing around Jericho, and on the final day, the walls of Jericho, they blew their horns, and the walls crumbled. And we have archaeological evidence of that today in Jericho. But this was used whenever they went into battle. Before they even went to Jericho, they took this thing. They had to cross the Jordan River to get to it. So what they did was priests carried this thing up to the river and into the river, and the waters parted on both sides. And it allowed Israel to pass through dry through the Jordan River, and so they could assault Jericho. But all kinds of miraculous things happened when this thing was around. They carried it in front of them into battle, and there are accounts inside and outside of the Bible of this thing doing all kinds of fire and lightning coming out of it and these type of things. But anyway. So what happened was, several years later, after all this, the 40 years, after Israel after they had left wandering in Sinai for 40 years, and they entered the Promised Land, book of Jericho, in the book of Joshua, when they had attacked Jericho, and after about this time, several years later, it was moved to a place called Bethel, or Beit El in Hebrew, which the house of God, and it sat there for several years. And then after Bethel, it was moved to Shiloh, and it sat in Shiloh for several hundred years. That's the account of read about in 1 Samuel 3 when Samuel heard the voice of God calling him. He was a priest, and he slept in the courtyard of the complex, and he heard God calling him from the ark. And this is today. This is the boundary that's drawn here. This is in Shiloh. This tradition says, Jewish tradition says, this is where the ark sat for about 300 years in the Mishkan. They marked it out with stone to mark the perimeter of the complex, of the Mishkan. And it measures, it's interesting because it measures the dimensions exactly that fit the Bible. 300 years in this spot, the ark sat. And from there, it was captured. There's an interesting story in the Bible we're going to look at. It was captured by the Philistines. During the time there, the high priest, Eli, was the high priest at the time. This is several hundred years after its construction. This is long after Moses has been dead and everyone else. And Eli had a couple of sons who were priests, but they weren't devoted to God, and they were very corrupt. So it was during this time that Israel was not following God in the way that he had intended to. They were starting to backslide. So he allowed that the priests carried this, said, well, God will be with us. And so they carried it in the battle, and they lost because God had withdrawn his presence from the ark and didn't allow them to win. So what happened was the Philistines, remember hearing a story about the Philistines. Philistines captured the ark, and they took it back to Philistia as kind of a war trophy. They paraded this thing around. Well, soon after this happened, people started dying in Philistia. They started getting boils and plagues and diseases and tumors all over their bodies. Why? Because you're not supposed to look at this thing. Yet they carried this thing around. It was interesting. For many years, they took the ark and they would move it to different cities in Philistia and in their country. They would pass it off. Like, we don't want this thing more. Here, give it to our neighbors. Well, they got to the point where they're like, you know what? This thing is causing our people to die. Just send this thing back to Israel. We don't want this thing anymore. They were afraid to destroy it. You think, well, why didn't they keep it and melt it down for its gold? They were afraid to touch the thing. If the thing was intact and it was causing diseases and plagues and people were dying, imagine what God would do to them if they attempted to destroy it. So they said, look, just give this thing back. We don't want this anymore. Give it back to them, give them a peace offering, so we're not plagued by the God of Israel anymore. So it was during this time that in 1 Samuel 5, what they do is they carried it, they put this thing in their temple, the God they worship. The Philistines worship, of the many gods they worship this one God called Dagon. And it was kind of like a half man, half fish. And what happened was, and here's the temple of Dagon, and here's the ark where they put it in. They put the ark in next to the statue of Dagon. And they thought, oh, we're going to put, since our God is superior, we're going to show our superiority, and we're going to put this ancient relic of Israel, we're going to put it in there, and we're going to show our dominance over this God. What was interesting, because the biblical account, look at it, is God is kind of, one way of looking at this account is that God has a sense of humor. Okay? What happened on the first day, they took the Ark of the Covenant and they put it inside the temple of Dagon. On the first night, what happened was, it was as if God just took his finger and knocked over the statue of Dagon. They woke up in the morning and they walked into their temple, and the statue of Dagon's lying on the floor right next to the ark. So they put it back up. They stand it back up. The next day they come in. God did it again, except this time he not only is it lying on the floor, but the head and the hands have been cut off. And that's what this picture is showing. The head's been cut off, the hands. Which was very significant because in the ancient world, you think, oh, that's too bad about the hands and the head. Well, the reason is this. God was showing his superiority over this God because in the ancient world, your God was all about his hands and his head. Why? Because the head was for thinking and the hands were for doing. God was saying, this God does not stand against me. So it says in 1 1 Samuel 5, I'll read it. It says, when the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, not far from Jerusalem. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. When the people of Ashdod rose on the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back up in his place. And when they rose early in the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face again, downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head and both the hands were cut off and lying on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon, who all entered the house of Dagon, do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod this day. So they're saying they were even afraid to walk into the building after this happened. So they take this thing and like, fine, give this thing back to Israel. On 1 Samuel 6:19, so what they do is they take this thing. Now, we've already read that the ark is to be transported and moved around only by its poles. Okay, it has to be carried on the shoulders of the priests. The only way that God instructed this object to be moved. So, what the Philistines do, they say, look, we want to get rid of this thing, and they don't know anything about the Old Testament. They don't know anything about the Bible. They stick it on a wagon, have it drawn by an ox. And they said, take this thing to Israel, take it to the borders of Israel, leave it there, and just let them deal with it. We don't want it anymore. So they stick this thing on a cart, and off it goes. And it ends up near this place called Beth Shemesh. And in 1 Samuel 6:19 it says, Now imagine it's there, just out in the open on this cart, and people come up to it in this town, and they start looking at it, and they start looking into it. Some of them probably knew what it was, some of them probably didn't. But what happened was the biblical account says there was like 70 people that just died because they dared look in this thing. So in 1 Samuel 6:19 it says, and he struck the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. He struck 70 men, and the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people such a great blow. Now, several years pass, more time passes, and David wants to move this thing, the ark to, he wants to move it to Israel. David has this great idea. King David has this great idea. He said, I want to take the ark. Now we're talking about, this is probably 400 years after its original construction. Okay? So David says, you know what? I want to make a permanent tabernacle to God. I want to bring, I want to build a permanent stone structure. I don't want the tent anymore. I want to build it. It's laid out the same way. The Holy of Holies, the most holy place, the altar, the wash basin, the whole thing. But I just want something more permanent to rest the ark. So he instructs his men to bring the ark back to Jerusalem because it's too low at this time. He wants them to bring it back so they can put it into the temple. Okay? The temple is actually built and done by Solomon, not by David. God actually wouldn't allow David to build it because David had too much blood on his hands. But it was his son Solomon who actually built the temple. They brought the thing back. But when they were bringing this thing back to Israel, you think King David, of all people, was very knowledgeable on the Bible. After all, he's credited for writing at least 75 of the Psalms in the Bible. But he had them bring this thing and stick it on a cart and said, bring it back. Well, what happened was, and this is a fiction of it, they have the ark sitting on the, covered up, and it's sitting on this cart. Well, what happens is, some point when they're transporting this thing, it's on a rough road and the thing tips and the ark starts to fall off the cart. And this man named Uzzah was a good man. He had good intentions. Reaches his hand out to steady the ark so it doesn't fall off. And he's struck dead on the spot. He had good intentions, but the ark was not being handled. It was never to be touched. It could only The only contact that priests could, he had to be a priest. The only contact with this thing is through its poles. And it says, first in 2 Samuel 6:7, when they came to the threshing floor of Nahon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. Died there on the spot for the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. This place is called Perazua to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. Now, what was going on, as I said, it was not his heart. He had good intentions, but God had already instructed that that is not to be. It's not to be handled in this way. So anyway, David and his men have to go back to the Bible. He has to go back to the Bible and say, okay, we got to get this thing back to know how to handle this thing. So, and that might seem like, wow, God, that's pretty harsh. Do that. Uzzah was a good man, and just touches the thing, and you let it, and you kill him on the spot. The thing is, the way we understand this is God is very powerful. Okay, God had laid down and said, "This is how it is to be handled." Okay, I think of it like this. I think about electrical power, like an electrical power plant. You know, you have these out in the country here. They have those electrical power substations. You see them every so often. I think they got one down here by Marlon and Carol's house. Now, if you went out to this thing, all right, and you went out and started messing around with it, you went past the gate that says danger, high voltage, started messing with the lines there, what do you think is going to happen to you? You're probably going to get fried, right? Electricity is not evil. It just simply is electricity, and it's dangerous. And it has to be handled in a certain way. You got to wear rubber gloves, right? And a suit, and you got to, all that kind of stuff, right? You have to have insulation. Same thing with God. He said, "Look, you got to handle this in a certain way. I am holy." They didn't do it, and that's what happened. So, mentioned in look at the book of Jeremiah 3:16. It says, "And when you have been multiplied and fruitful in the land, in those days declares the Lord, there shall be no one that said, they shall no more say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord, for it shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed, not be made again." The thing was made once and only once, and it fit the pattern of its heavenly counterpart from which it was designed. Mentioned, and we see it in Revelation chapter 11. It says, "Then God's temple, heaven was opened, and the ark of the covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail." So, those are just a few times that it's mentioned directly in Scripture, mentioned other times in passing, but this was an incredible object of God's presence in representing his holiness. So, now there are three main ideas as to what actually happened to this thing. There's actually like 50 major theories, but there's like three predominant ones. And the thing is, it was very specific in its design. As you heard me read it, and in the argument, people say, "Oh, this thing never really existed." Well, it's kind of hard to argue that when God is very specific on its construction. See that, and we've seen historical evidence of the menorah, the lampstand. As we saw several weeks ago, the menorah that sat in the tabernacle, it was etched in stone on that Roman monument that covered on the Arch of Titus. So we know that these things are, we know that this thing is somewhere. But the first theory is that it's in a cave in the country of Jordan somewhere. Now, the reason we get this idea is from this book called the Book of Maccabees, Second Maccabees. Now, if you had a Catholic Bible, this is not a book that's in our Bible. This is a book that's in the middle of the Catholic Bible, and it's in a place called the Apocrypha, the Apocryphal book. Now, as Christians, non-Catholics, we recognize this to be not a book, not a divine book, not inspired by God. Okay, not a book that would go into the Bible, but in a genuine historical book. So evangelical Christians and historians, Christian historians say, yes, we don't recognize this as authoritative from God. However, we recognize it as a valid history. Because that's what it was. It was an account of history. But anyway, in the book of 2 Maccabees, in chapter 2, it says, when Jeremiah arrived there, he found a chamber in a cave, which he put the tent, the ark, and the altar of incense. And he sealed the entrance. Some of those who followed him up, intending to mark the path, but they could not find it. Jeremiah heard of this. He reproved them, saying, the place to remain unknown until God gathers his people together again, shows them mercy. The Lord will disclose these things. And the glory of the Lord and the cloud will be seen, just as they appeared in the time of Moses and Solomon. They prayed at that place. Might be greatly sacrificed. Now, because of the movie, the Indiana Jones movie, it started a wide interest, like worldwide. I mean, believers and non-believers alike. So people are trying to find this thing. This is like a serious thing. It still goes on today. People still talk about this. And there's been many books written on it, many ideas out there, scholars, archaeologists, believers and non-believers alike, who really look for this thing. The second theory of where this thing lies in the modern day, somewhere under the Temple Mount. Now, what you're looking at this is in Jerusalem, okay? This is the Temple Mount right here, this whole structure right here. This was actually built by King Herod, okay? This is where the temple sat. Now, this is not the temple. This is the Dome of the Rock. This is a Muslim building, okay? And I won't go into it today, but they're up here and claim that this is a sacred spot for them that has nothing to do with triune God. But anyway, they are up here, and there's always been contention between the Jews and the Muslims. That's why all that fighting is going on in the Middle East. They hate each other. The Muslims hate the Jews. The Jews have to protect themselves because you constantly have the Muslims basically trying to wipe them out. You know, this is the whole thing going on. It even goes on today. But anyway, this structure right here was made by King Herod to support the second temple because the first one was destroyed, so they had to construct a second one. Anyway, we'll finish up here, but there is it lies under here. Okay, this is where the original or the temple sat. So this is what it would have looked like back in the time of Jesus. It took about 70 years to build all of this. During the time of the Gospels, this thing was still under construction. Its construction started before the virgin birth of Christ. It continued after his death and resurrection. This was a monumental task. One of these blocks, I was watching a show in the History Channel one time. One of these, these are made of massive granite stone blocks. Each individual block that makes up this weighs like 500 metric tons. One. So this is a massive structure. Anyway, the third theory of where this thing is that it's in Ethiopia, and this is actually probably the strongest theory that there is for where this thing vanished to. And there's this is a Christian church in Ethiopia, of all places, and they claim to have the ark. And the story, keep it short, goes basically like this: there was a time in the Bible when King Solomon was king, and the Queen of Sheba came to visit him. Okay, and Jewish tradition says that they had fathered a child together, and she went back to Ethiopia. Sheba means Ethiopia. Okay, and so he goes. The story is that she goes back to. There's an account in the Bible where it says when she went back to Ethiopia, God gave her everything that she wanted, or not God. Solomon gave her everything she wanted. The thing is, this theory goes that their son Menelik took the ark ahead of them because he was afraid something was going to be happening to it. But anyway, it's a long, convoluted theory, but this is probably the best one. They claim to have it. Now, what's interesting is that these people, there's a guardian. Nobody's seen it. Nobody has actually seen it. They just claim to have it. And it's hidden away downstairs and covered up and everything. And there's like one monk, and this is him. One sole guardian of this thing. He claimed to actually have it. Okay? But the idea is that it's in here, and that it's interesting because these Ethiopians, actually they've done DNA testing on these people, and they have like Jewish blood in their DNA. I mean, they legitimately do. But sometime during history, they had some kind of connection with the Jews. But anyway, they say, well, yeah, a long time ago, the Jews brought it down here, and we protected it, and we've had it. And so even to this day, right now, it's in Aksum, Ethiopia, and you can go see the building. You can't get into the building and look at it, right, because it's not to be seen. But nonetheless. So with all that information about the Ark of the Covenant, what is the meaning? Well, it is a picture of God's presence. He is with his people. God's glory sits above the ark. It is a reminder that in Old Testament times, God was a God of grace and forgiveness. God set aside one day a year to offer forgiveness for all sins. Once a year, the priest would enter with his white robes with a bowl full of blood, the bull he just killed, and with his fingers sprinkle the blood on and before the ark. Symbolize God's forgiveness of sins. Christ and blood is required to meet God's righteous requirements, forgiveness of sins. Romans 6:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life, Christ Jesus our Lord. The thing is, when there's sin, there's death is imposed. Death is the only thing, the shedding of blood is the only thing that can undo the stain of sin. Someone has to die, so we learn from the lamb, the animal. Somebody or something has to die for your sins. Christ is the one who has died for your sins and paid the penalty for sin. God's price had to be paid, and Jesus paid that price for you. So I've just explained the entire gospel message, and the entire gospel message is outlined in the tabernacle. So when you go out and tell people about the gospel, it's as simple as that. The idea is that we are sinners, and because of this, price has to be paid, and if you believe it, we'll pay your price. There's also a reminder of our constant access to God. You no longer have to go to a priest. You don't come and confess your sin to me. You don't have to do a sacrifice. You can go directly to God through Christ yourself. There's no need for an intercessor. Christ is our intercessor. It's interesting because at the moment, when we look at the book of Matthew, there's the moment during the crucifixion of Christ, at that moment that Christ died, there's the veil of the temple. Now, the priest is standing here in front of here's the curtain separating him from the Ark of the Covenant. It says that when Christ died, at the moment he died, the curtain was torn from top to bottom. It says that in the New Testament, meaning you no longer have to go to a priest. Go to Christ directly yourself. Like God reached down and ripped it in half. There's no longer one man and one day a year, but anyone to go to God directly through Christ. The story of the New Testament is the story of the Old Testament. God is with us. I hope this series has been helpful in understanding something that's kind of been obscured, and in that, so that you understand. Look at the temple. When you look at the tabernacle, understand is how it all works.